So the intention is to walk up to the bananas, walk down the hill through the banana plantation and look at the ones that are doing well and the ones that aren't, and the citrus the same. Get down to the bottom, look at the solar pump and the irrigation system, because when I rang Graham on the phone shortly after here, he said, you really should take advantage of the sealed dam, and I think that's the best advice I've had, because it's a wonderful blessing to have permanent water here. And the water doesn't appear to be acid. It's got, I think, nitrogen and phosphorus in it, but it doesn't appear to be acidic. It appears to be about 6.5 or something.
Yeah.
So I've got a pump that the pump that goes to the top of the hill, and then it gravitates to the whole of the property.
Okay.
So that's taken a lot of time, and the weeds have been a bit neglected while I've been doing that.
I'll answer that if you like.
Thanks, Ken.
Yeah, no worries.
There's not 25, I'm afraid. But, any questions? And I think Tara's going to drive the bus down the drive and pick people up, take them up to the house for morning tea and the worm demonstration. If you've got an appetite, or if we've got time, those people can walk up the hill along the path and look at that feeble plantation over there, where we've got macadamias, jackfruit, ice cream bean, figs and a few other things, with very uneven results. And then we'll have morning tea at the house, and then after that we'll look at the Western Gully, which has got some quite different lessons.
Okay. All right, so my history was that I think I mentioned when I did my talk the other day, that I was brought over by the government to do some training in sort of sustainable food production, and they asked me to test most of the food producing soils. So we're associated with a soil lab at Southern Cross University in Lismore, so we took I think 50 or 45 samples across the island, and there were just this whole series of similar deficiencies. And you asked me yesterday whether we can get access to those tests, and I will be able to look back through the archives and find them, and you can put them on your website, and it will give people a good conception. And there's talk of whether we should redo that at this point. And what we did on the strength of that, because there were 5 minerals that were missing in every soil, and 2 of those minerals, interestingly, were copper and boron, and you were mentioning your soil joints, but if you look at the actual statistics, and I did at that time, Norfolk had amongst the highest levels of arthritis per head of population of anything in Australia, and there's a profound link between, literally on this island you are what you eat, because you're eating everything grown in these soils, or majority of, there was imported potatoes and onions at that point, everything else you ate from the island. So more than anywhere else, it's like a little microcosm that you could see that phenomenon at work. And so, the outcome of being what you are, what you eat, and what you eat comes from a soil, in this case, that lacks 5 minerals. Most people lack those 5 minerals, and 2 of them are intimately and profoundly linked to arthritis. So one of the interesting findings, my podcast, which I did because I couldn't travel and teach. So 2-3 years back, I started this podcast called the Nutrition Farming Podcast, and it's gone on to become this insane phenomenon. It's in the top 5 in some countries, and it's like hundreds of thousands of views, and it's become a little bit of a nightmare in the sense that there's just hundreds of emails to answer and so forth. But I do a human health component of that, and one of those components of the many things I talk about was just this very simple thing of taking some borax, there's a recipe there, and diluting it, and then drinking a percentage of this very diluted borax. It gives you 3 milligrams of boron on a daily basis, but it's life-changing for people with arthritis, and not every case, but in multiple cases. It's one of the many things I've shared that I've got amongst the most feedback, is just getting some boron and your joints stopping hurting, sort of thing. So the idea was to do that with a fertilizer. So we created a fertilizer called Norfolk Gold that had those components. Unfortunately, the people that were making it for us, well, they ripped us off. They were making prescription blends for us, and then they started poaching our customers and saying we can do it $20 cheaper or whatever. So we had to drop them. So we stopped making Norfolk Gold, but we're thinking very strongly about, maybe retesting and making something appropriate for the island, so that you can have that nutrition that's required. So I sort of, in the process of testing, the one thing that came through, apart from those deficiencies, was this really, really unusual high levels of organic matter. So the average was 12%, and that's unheard of. There's nowhere that I work, and we work in 57 countries, that's got 12% average. So that's freakish. And organic matter is the most important single thing for growing stuff. So if you can correct the mineral deficiencies in the beautiful soils with this base organic matter, which is the essence of growing stuff, then you've got tremendous potential. And as the administrator, when I was there yesterday, mentioned, I went out to his little farm to help him with some things. 470 hectares were under cultivation for vegetables on Norfolk in 1912, and now there's between 12 and 15. And you know, that's ridiculous. I mean, you've got these soils with insane potential, and everyone everywhere could be growing stuff on them. But that growing stuff and having that growing stuff work, there's a couple of handicaps. So I mentioned the importance of organic matter, just to give you some idea of the importance of that. The National Bank, the dominant mantra in agriculture has been get bigger or get out. And so people are coming to the National Bank, the largest bank in Australia, and saying that we want to buy our neighbour's farm to make us more efficient. And so they tick the boxes to see if you qualify for the loan. You do, they loan you the money, and then an unacceptable percentage of those loans are falling over. Yep. So they said, okay, we need to redefine what determines profitability. So in the Hillston region of New South Wales, for 3 years, they looked at 800 farms, and they looked at everything. Is it the amount of NPK fertiliser? Is it the size of your tractor? Is it your marketing skills or your accounting skills, either of which can determine your profitability? And to the absolute surprise of everyone, what determined profitability was the percentage of organic matter. It was absolutely head and shoulders above everything, was the percentage of organic matter in the soil, because it's essentially the essence of growing stuff. For every 0.15%, which is not much, organic matter in those soils, they put a value on the soil, saying that was worth so many hundreds of dollars or more per hectare because that was its productive potential. Well, you've got that starting point here of 12%, and so I decided I wanted a piece of that. You know, once in my life I want to own 12%. So I was at the airport waiting for the plane, you've got to be there 2 hours earlier, and I mentioned to Simon Biggs, about, as you know, if any little blocks of land come up, little farm comes up on the island, I wouldn't mind having a look. He said, oh, there's one just come up on the market. So we charged off while the plane was waiting. They actually had to wait for us, and they did. And we charged around in this four-wheel drive around this place, and I put an offer in and they turned it down. Then they went bankrupt, unfortunately, a few months later. They were struggling to pay off a mortgage, and for whatever reason.
Yeah. How do you measure the organic rate in the soil?
The organic matter.
Yeah, organic.
Yeah, so it's part of a soil test, and there's a whole technique. It's called the Walker-Blakely test that measures the percentage of organic matter. I mean, you can see it with just the darkness of the soil. Interestingly, up at that administrator's property, Eric's property yesterday, he's got a little paddock out the front that if I was here I'd say, look, can I lease that paddock, because that is the most chocolate coloured dark soil that I've ever seen on the island. So it's just got wonderful potential. So when you grow stuff and you try and make money from it, there are three things basically that you're managing. You're managing minerals, you're managing microorganisms, and you're managing humus. Well, you've got one of those bases covered. You've got the humus, you know, and that's the most important of the three. It's the home. So what is the role of humus? Well, you know, basically when you put things into a soil, if you put a fertiliser or nutrition or whatever, or chicken manure, whatever you're putting in there, how does it stay there? Well, humus is the only thing in the soil that holds everything. It's got little Velcro sites that can hold negatively charged minerals that are called anions, and it's got positively charged negatively charged that can hold positively that can hold negative, and it's the only thing that can do that. Clay has got little negatively charged sites that can hold calcium and magnesium. They're called cations, positively charged, but that's all they can store, not the negative charged things like nitrate, nitrogen, and phosphorus, and boron, and so forth. But humus holds everything, so it's wonderful from a mineral perspective. But the bigger story is basically it's the home base. It was created by soil life, by microorganisms, and it becomes their home base and support system.
We'll need to move on, I think, or we're running out of time.
Okay, yeah.
But I'd just like to say, please, I know very well that we should be doing more mulching around the trees, whipper snipping and cutting the grass. It's labour intensive. It's probably too big a property for me. Yeah. And if I had a few granddaughters and sons and that who could come and help for nothing, then it'd be much easier. But I'd like to sort of look beyond whinging about labour and I'm too tired and too old and all the rest of it, and look rather at the lessons that the plants have for nutrition and the soils. And I'm open to advice. I don't have any ego. I've gardened in the Dandenong Ranges in Victoria, which they said was the best horticultural place in the world, and I don't believe it. I reckon this is probably
Yeah,
better.
it's got potential. Yeah.
Gardened in Papua New Guinea and gardened in the lowlands and highlands in Brisbane, and this is quite unique and it's a real challenge. So I'm open to advice.
Well, part of that story, and it continues the mineral story, is that the limitation, you've got all this organic matter, so you've got the wonderful thing, but the limitation is the red soils. And the red soils are great, they're volcanic origin, and they've got lots of good things in them. But the red colour comes from iron oxide, and that therein lies your problem with the bananas and a whole range of things, because iron ties up phosphorus, and you can't grow stuff without phosphorus. Everything has charges, 1, 2 or 3. Phosphorus has the most negative charges and iron has the most positive charges. So you've got 3 on 3 and they go doink and create iron phosphate, and you can't get phosphate into the plant.
Is that why bananas are struggling on Norfolk?
Yeah, they can't. They have to have a lot of phosphorus.
Okay, would you like to walk up, follow the mown path?
Camera? Okay, folks. So what we're looking at here is a sort of a banana planting on the side of a hill. One of the things with bananas, of course, is that they're subtropical and they love moisture, so there's going to be a bit of a problem keeping enough moisture to them in this context, and so they would need to be really heavily mulched to try and keep them in there. But the other thing about bananas, and it's one of the shortages on Norfolk, is that they're the most potassium hungry known plant. Avocados are second. So they absolutely, you just wouldn't believe the amount of potassium that commercial banana growers put on. It's actually tons of potassium sulfate. So to grow them without potassium is very difficult. You tend to get short bunches. You don't get the big full bunch because they simply haven't got the potassium to do it. So they prune what they can produce. And potassium is, as I mentioned, even though it's expensive, unfortunately, it's one of the minerals that is most lacking on the island. So compost, and I understand you've got a compost up at the waste thing there, have you? Well, compost does contain significant amounts of potassium, so piling on the compost will help, along with the many other things that compost does. But they do look, to me, like they're lacking the vibrance that usually comes with potassium, and perhaps a little bit of nitrogen as well. Now, the essence of nitrogen and how you can not pay the huge amounts of money for it, which of course is urea, is trebled in price globally. The essence is several things. You want to have nitrogen fixation happening in the soil, which involves certain organisms which you can introduce into the soil, and you can brew up and do that side of it. But also really important is legumes, and if you look around, there's not a lot of legume component, and it's not difficult to get some clover seed or whatever, and before you mulch, you just scatter it out and then mulch over it, cut the grass over it, so you've got a little bit of a base as that mulch breaks down for the seed to germinate. But it's really, really important to understand how important legumes are in the equation. So you all know that they should have little nodules on the base of the roots, so these tiny little balls, and those balls house organisms called rhizobium bacteria that grab the gas in the atmosphere and turn it into nitrogen in the soil. So that's really important role, the provision of nitrogen. But 2 more important minerals for the most important process. And the most important process is photosynthesis, is this production of sugars that drives the whole plant growth. And the 2 most important minerals for that are calcium and phosphorus. And the problem with calcium and phosphorus is one's negative, one's positive, and they go doink and form insoluble calcium phosphate. So most of the phosphate anyway in the soil is tied up with calcium. But what legumes do uniquely, and this is what your clover in here would do, they spit out an acid exudate that breaks the bond between calcium and phosphorus. So not only are they giving you nitrogen, they're also giving the plant next to them, and in this case the grass plants, a source of calcium and phosphorus, because they're constantly pouring out this acid to break that bond. So that's a hell of a thing to have. It's quite difficult in dense kikuyu, but it's possible to get a clover component in there. But certainly here it would be a very easy thing to do, to get clover working in the soil. But then it's not quite as simple as saying we put it there and the job's done. First of all, you've got to not have nodules, and if you don't have any nodules on the clover, so you get a shovel and dig, and we might look at some legumes down the back, some beans, and see what they're doing. But they've got to have nodules, and if they don't have nodules, that's a deficiency of sulfur. That's the classic signpost of that trace mineral called sulfur. You can't form nodules without sulfur, so that's you need to get some gypsum, which is calcium sulfate, into that scenario if you haven't got nodules. But then, even more important is if you've got nodules, you need to take a little pocket knife or even a sheet of white paper where you can squash them, but they need to have a red pigment inside the little nodules. You need to slice them and they've got this quite visible red colour in there. And that red colour is called leg hemoglobin. So just like our blood's called hemoglobin, it's kind of like, well, it looks like the blood pigment, and it kind of is the blood of the plant in a sense. But interestingly, with this whole new advent of fake meats, they've actually found plants that have very big nodules and lots of that red stuff, and that's the fake blood. They actually take the red pigment from the legumes and they pump that into the fake meat.
There's virtually no legumes here except some vetches.
Yeah.
And but the citrus trees, even where the vetches are growing, are weak.
Yeah.
And so there's something else as well as the
So we
nitrogen.
need to look at the vetches
Yeah.
and see if they've got nodules and see if they've got colour inside the nodules.
If you walk down either of these two pathways, I know the grass is a bit rough, but there shouldn't be any trip hazards.
Yeah.
If we go down the bottom, you can look at the bananas on the right.
Yeah.
A couple have actually been so poor they've died,
Yeah.
and the citrus on the left.
Okay.
And the citrus are all seedlings. Yes.
Ice cream beans are legumes.
Yes. Yep. Well, we'll see
So we can have a look and see if they've got nodules when we get up there.
We'll see the effect of that up.
So we're taking a spade when we walk up that hill?
We've got a shovel though.
Good, that's good.
Beresford's got a shovel, I think.
Great.
Yep, good. Off we go.
So we move on down?
Happy to move down. Keep talking as we go.
Yeah, no
Probably.
problems.
Sorry, Luca. We're going to challenge you.
Not going to be easy for filming, that's for sure.
Just very quickly, you can see how poorly this banana is, and I'm assuming it's because the ground has been scalped and there's nothing much in the soil at all, down to subsoil, but might be wrong. And you can see that the citrus are uneven, but mostly fairly yellow here, but they're a little bit greener further up the hill. You'll see a jackfruit there. We probably won't have time to walk through there. The jackfruit there is only a year old, and it's better than the ones up there that are getting on for 3 years or 2.5 years old. There's a couple of mangoes doing very well, but the intention now, we'll walk down to the dam.
I'll just point out that the classic symptom of potassium deficiency on almost every crop, including orchard crops, is that the lower leaves get that yellowing and they get a burnt edge on the outer edge. And that's a classic deficiency of that. There's no potassium. You can't grow bananas without potassium, so you could kick that one in by getting some potassium under it.
Okay.
So we are going to have a look at this dam, are we? And I'll explain how that was done.
Sure. The dam's quite important because I think there are a few people who go with a Briggs and Stratton who would like to see this system, and I'm grateful to Graham for pointing out the desirability, and I've got a pipe now going up there, right around there, up there, all over the whole property, and just fed from this one dam. So just take it easy. There should be no hazards. Although we don't have any cattle at the moment, and we don't aspire to putting cattle back, we've left the fences in position because they mark land use zones. And the land use zone here was bush regeneration. I have cheated a bit by putting in a few pumpkins, and you might see a couple of pumpkin seedlings here and there. The first year the rats ate them. The second year I planted them down there and they're all flooded. But this year I hope to get something. The tree ferns that you see are all only 2 years old, and they're grown from spores that I've grown myself. The other plant, Tara, you might be able to tell me what it is, I've forgotten, but it came from the National Parks nursery. The native plant. Nettle, that's it, yeah. There's a few nettles, they came from the Parks nursery. And I've also got about 50 native Norfolk Island palms scattered. The first lot I grew and planted them out, and the rats ate them. The second lot I twisted the remaining remnant of the nut off before I planted them, and they've all survived. So it's a big risk to plant out nut trees or trees with nuts on them before the nuts have completely removed. The rats eat the pecans out of my pecan seedlings around the house. We'll have a look at that later. This pipe is the overflow pipe that goes when the top tank is full, runs back to the dam, so there's no waste if the pump is working and there's and there's too much water. This area here has been scalped or something, and you can see when you walk over it the topsoil that's flowed down the hill into the dam. I've made a bit of an effort to put some branches there to give it a bit of protection, and that's starting to work with the kikuyu spreading over it, but it's just about down to bedrock. If you walk around the edge here, you'll see those tree ferns are all self-sown. It's remarkable that tree ferns will survive when the sun cooks them in exposed position like that, but they're doing very well. In the botanist here, there's 2 species of tree ferns on the big property next door, right side by side to each other.
So I'll explain the process of, Norfolk is notoriously difficult to build dams. I mean, when you get rain, like the big dam over there, it will fill, but it doesn't hold water. And there's very, very few dams that do. There's a couple of the convicts have made by hand and so forth. So I decided on this property that I would utilise a permaculture principle called glaying, G-L-E-Y-I-N-G. So glaying kind of explains probably the best example of that at work is Fraser Island, because we've got this beautiful, if any of you have ever been to Fraser Island, huge island, massive, amazing forests and so forth, all on pure sand. But I mean, how do you have these huge, big, in some cases multicoloured, clear lakes you can swim in, and it almost feels primeval when you're swimming in there with the rainforest around the edges. It's so beautiful. But how does that happen? How does sand hold water? It's theoretically impossible. That's the natural process of glaying that's happened where there's been, massive erosion and huge big basins created, and then with storms, and in this case probably cyclones, that is filled up with organic matter, and then sand is blown over top of it. So the concept is that if you can get a layer about this thick of organic matter and then seal it, in this case we just use builder's plastic, which doesn't hold water, doesn't stop water or anything, but because it's just, we don't even seal it, I mean just a piece here and a piece there overlapping it. On top, but to create this anaerobic organisms with no oxygen who then come in and they create this gluing effect, which is exactly what's happened on Fraser, and that's called glaying. So and then they glue and seal the dam, and you've got a dam. And so I thought, well, what can you lose? I'll try it. It costs more because we had to get a combine harvester and harvest whoever wanted to have a free slash, and then bring truckloads, on this difficult site, and then cover the entire base with this layer this thick, and then covered that, and then it sat there for a while, and then it rained, and then it held water. So I was thrilled, but it costs probably double the cost of a normal dam. But you've got a permanent water source that I mentioned at the time would be a great idea to put a solar pump in, and then you can service. It's quite deep. You don't get the concept.
It went to 1 metre deep at the worst of the lowest at the end of the drought.
Yeah,
we still had 1 metre of water in, and has overtopped a few times this year, which are a real surprise. It's overtopped, and the top metre dropped fairly quickly, but still it drops very, very slowly from now on down.
Yeah, it holds nicely.
And I'd expect it would still have 1 metre in the lowest point, even at the end of the dry.
So how deep is it now?
It'd be 1.5 metres, I think, at the deepest point, but it shallows off. It'd be 1.5 metres, yes.
Do you think bentonite works? That's what we used to use to seal dams?
Yeah, I mean it does, but not. I mean the amount that will be involved will be much more expensive than that other concept, because you really got it. There's not, usually you use whatever clay you've got and you top it up with bentonite, but there's no clay. There's not the component to build here. It's just this crumbly red stuff that doesn't build.
I don't think the volume is enough for a commercial farm, but it's okay for just a hobby. We aspire to a garden like Derek and Andrea's. And if you come back in 15 years, it might be something.
Of most people that were there the other day.
We aspire to that. We aspire to self-sufficiency for ourselves in fruit and veg. It's a long, long process. But I think if we move around here to the dam...
Just talk us, there's things to talk about. And one of the things is the whole concept of weeds, which, we call them weeds, and really it's just a plant that we don't want there at that point. But they've very commonly got a story to tell. And one of those weeds that has a story to tell, and I have a personal history with it on this farm, is behind us here, and it's called lantana. And that bank that goes down to the second gully, you might not be aware, but that was solid lantana, nothing but lantana. And I could sit on that veranda and there'd be all these little birds tweeting away. And then there was a bulldozer next door on this place that Matt's family owns now. And I thought, I come from New Zealand originally, and New Zealanders are notoriously the most tight-ass people on the planet. You can hear their bottoms squeak in the street.
You mean boys in the Dutch?
They're from Dutch, and who are the other Tainos people? It's a combination of both. Scottish and Dutch is where they come from, so it's a fusion. Not all of them, but quite a percentage. But anyway, so I thought, well, I don't have to pay for freight. I don't have to pay for haulage to bring the bulldozer here. He's right here, so I'll get him to clear this lantana. Well, lantana was really pretty and housed. So he came with the bulldozer, and it cost me a couple of hours of labour or less to clear the entire bank. And then I was going flying out the next day. I had no game plan, which is the most silly thing you could ever do, of what was going to replace it. And then I came back and it's just this ugly scrub. From this beautiful thing to this ugly scrub. Now the role of lantana only grows where there's no calcium, and what it does is mine calcium. And if we were to dig under here, if there's any earthworms on this place, this is where they'll be. You know, it's an absolutely remarkable soil conditioner. And the moment you lime, within a year it disappears. It can't grow when there's enough calcium. Its role is to derive calcium from a soil that's lacking calcium, and so it will go down deep and it will mine, or will spread out and mine, and it's got enzymes that can make calcium available, and it will make that area this friable, beautiful soil. When it was all earthworms and this beautiful friable soil on the bank, when they hauled it all off, and then I come back and there's this ugly scrub that no birds, nothing. It was just a silly thing to do. I mean, I remember being on a field day for this Iwasaka Resort. They've got this 3,000 acres of beef property. They've cleared it, and as we walk around, the farmers are all kicking bloody lantana because there's a little bit that's come through that didn't get poisoned out successfully. We're measuring the pasture with, we'll teach you how to do that later, with the refractometer, which measures how nutrient dense, how good's the food value. Needs to be above 12. It was 4. And everywhere we dug, no earthworms, nothing. It was just a really deficient soil. And then this thing that everyone was saying, bloody lantana, and kicking at, I said, let's have a look. So we dig underneath each little piece. The only worms on the entire place, the only crumbly soil on the whole place, and the bricks of the lantana was 17, because calcium's a trucker of all minerals. It made calcium available, which delivered the other minerals. And why the farmers hate it is because it's so sweet, cows will eat it, and it has an active ingredient that can poison them. So it's called lantanoid.
I can support that story because the family property in Brisbane covered in lantana, and the soil underneath, you can push the shovel into the soil.
Beautiful soil.
Outside, no.
Yeah, no,
it really is a soil conditioner.
So we curse this plant, and it's actually doing a wonderful job. Yeah, and it's pretty. You know, what's wrong with it?
There's not much room at the pump, but it's quite interesting. It's switched off at the moment. I don't leave it run all the time because I don't want to wear it out more years than I need to. I'll switch it on when we're around there, and you'll see it start up because there's enough sunshine now to run it. There's no batteries, it's just one solar panel. And it drives the water to the top of the hill, 45 metres. It can go to 45 metres.
What kind of cost?
I've got the figures here. I've actually brought the quote. 2,500, I think, was the cost.
That's not bad.
I didn't have to pay much for freight because Max brought it over with his gear, and the piping, of course, is another matter. Yeah. But I've got the specifications here if someone would like to have a look.
Good. Oh, well, shall we walk around and have a look at that?
Just walk around on the contour over the erosion hill, and we'll assemble near the pump.
I had walked around here before.
I've got a float.
Okay.
That's my float. It's a bit ugly, but it works. And there's a pressure pipe, and then we'll give it a try. It's just a single switch.
Not getting enough sunlight.
Is there anything happening?
Can't hear. Yes.
Yes, it is working.
Yeah.
You can see the ripples in the water.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, you can hear it.
It
coming
is.
up
It's
the
just
pump,
got
yeah.
enough sun, I'd say. Oh, you can. If you put your hand on this, you can feel the vibration.
Yes.
So it's about 33 metres, I think, from here to the top of the tank, the header tank, and which is in the upper quartile of its performance, but it will go to more than 40 metres. Fairly slow volume, but volume's not important if it's just motoring along for a hobby household supply. I'd say there's nitrogen and phosphorus because of the algae in the water, and that's probably not a disadvantage. you'll see the remnants of the black plastic here and there, but they're not important now in the sealing, Graham.
No, it's only just that initial anaerobic decay that creates the glue that holds it all together. And then ideally you'd actually remove the plastic if you could, but it was too late, it filled up quickly.
Yep. I've got a 1-inch green line goes to the top of the hill, and an 1.5 inch coming back as the overflow, and the friction difference is only about 4 centimetres or something.
And then you gravity feed down to the lower valley
Gravity
as well.
feed everywhere else, yep.
Good.
Does this get covered with that weed? Do you have
Azolla. That was a good, there was, I thought I'd be very smart because this got absolutely thick with Azolla at the right time of the year. So I got out there with my waders and sometimes without that, and got a rake, and I raked all this stuff and carted it down to the garden beds, and I thought this was pretty good stuff, and it was. But then about 3 days later it all shrank and shriveled up, and it was just as if there was bare ground. It all disappeared. So it probably had some nutritious value, but it wasn't much good as a ground cover.
We've seen Azolla being harvested on dams at a place in Denmark in Western Australia, and they harvest it and put it in a solar dryer and use it as chook feed. They found that it was
Yeah, it's high
quite
protein.
nutrient
High protein, yeah.
It's green.
Mm.
Tried it.
They what? They like it when
They
it's
don't
green.
like it when it's
No,
green.
no, they were drying it, so maybe that was the way to do it. So you could grow your own chook feed.
There's a 5,000 gallon tank. I'd really love to have 10 or 20,000 gallons to store this when it's in flood or very high.
Yeah, that'd be great.
And I'm thinking of scrounging some old tin from the rubbish tip or something and putting a liner in it and so on. I haven't got around to that yet, but it's very expensive. It's $1 a gallon to store with a poly tank,
Is it?
or approximately by the time you pay for the installation. There's also, we've got 30,000 gallons of house water. After Snowy told us how much he had in his household, we went and bought another tank. So,
You could construct a turkey's nest dam up on the ridge
well,
and pump into that.
if we have time, I'd love to show you a site where I was thinking of a turkey's nest on the other gully.
Yeah.
But to repeat what you've done.
Yeah, that'd be a good
But
thing to do.
we might not have much time. We better keep moving.
Okay.
I think the easiest might be to just walk along the dam wall at the grade on the side of the dam to the bus, which will be sitting at the bottom of the driveway. If you've got energy and want to, you can walk up the hill along the pathway, which you'll see down there, and walk through the other plantation. But we're getting a bit short of time.
What time is it?
But it's nearly 10 o'clock.
Oh, okay. Yeah,
It depends. It'd be nice to have a look at the Western Gully, Graham.
yeah, I think so.
So I
I'd
think
like to
we
see
should
it.
press. I think we should go down.
Go up and have morning tea and then go down there.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But we also need time for the worm demonstration.
Yeah, we can do that. after
On the
morning tea.
way, there's a little area of vegetables, which is me trying to take advantage of the better soil and the moister part of the valley where I don't have to water, because watering is slow and hard work, even with the even with pipes. If you haven't got automatic irrigation, then it's slow, hard work to water vegetables. And I don't think there's enough water to just allow automatic irrigation that turns on. Maybe I could set it up with trickle with timing and working on the moisture sensitisation, but I haven't got that far yet. So I've tried to put a lot of the vegetables at the low spot where they'll get natural moisture. But it's a bit half-baked, I know that, but in a few years' time when it's covered with sugar cane, which is good mulch,
Yeah, it does.
and edible, then it mightn't look so bad.
So part of the story, as we said, minerals, microbes and humus, and the humus is kind of taken care of. So we start looking at the microbial side, and then if we look at the definition of the word science as adherence to natural laws and principles, and we say, okay, we're going to learn from nature the perfect blueprint. What is the central principle of nature? And the central principle of nature is biodiversity. That's how nature works. The more the merrier is the model. And that works above ground and below ground. And because plants photosynthesize, they create sugars, this glucose building block of everything, and they pump half of the sugars to the roots, and 60% of that half, which is 30% of the total production of their most precious substance, they just give away. It's kind of an example of kind of given you shall receive, and this army of organisms lives around the roots that will then take that glucose and use as an energy source to fix nitrogen and solubilize phosphate and deliver minerals and protect from disease and all of the good things that these organisms beneath the roots do. So the biological part of the equation is about diversity, and one of the greatest sources of diversity in some really wonderful and quite unique organisms is the earthworm. And so I ask wherever I travel in the world, how many of you have got good numbers of earthworms remaining? And there's one hand and 50 goes up. There's hugely lacking that whole story. Now there are several things you can do to change that equation. One of them involves something called a protozoa tea, and that's just lucerne, but unfortunately there doesn't seem to be a lot of lucerne on the island. I guess it costs a lot to import, but it would grow beautifully here. These soils would grow lucerne really well. But lucerne hay has a very high protein component, and protozoa, there's 3 types of them, all of them flourish and build in that, and so you take some hay, you take some liquid fish, is one thing that the protozoa love, and molasses. So it's just hay, liquid fish and molasses, and you've got to have some aeration happening in your brewing tank, which you can do on a small scale in a 20-litre bucket with a fish tank aerator and a couple of what are called air stones. For $20 you can buy a fish tank aerator with 2 outlets, and you put a little plastic pipe and you put a little stone that's about that long. It's just a piece of pumice circular cylinder of materials that send out hundreds of tiny bubbles, and so that's your 20-litre brewing apparatus. It's $25 to set up, and you would put your lucerne, you put this much lucerne into the bottom of it, and you put some, if you could source some liquid fish and some molasses, and it takes 2 days, not 1. And they just come off the hay and breed up, and at the end of 2 days, if you had a microscope, it's like sardines. And the favourite food, I mean, everyone's got their their favourite food. I mean, in South Africa it's biltong. In Australia, surprisingly, what do you think the Australian national favourite food is? No, that's what you'd think. So according to Choice magazine, it's spaghetti of all things is the favourite food. But the favourite food by far of earthworms is protozoa. They go ballistic. They'll come from all over. And I think I cited the other night an example of a viticulture guy with 40 acres of vines who said, well, I'm going to count, the holy grail is to have 25 earthworms per shovelful. You might do it over 2 or 3 times because they sometimes go down in the dry. But if you can achieve that holy grail of this nutrition farming or regenerative farming model, basically they're producing 300 tonnes of earthworm castings. And if you look at what the castings are an amazing fertiliser. They're 10 times more nitrogen, 8 times more phosphorus, 6 times more magnesium, 3 times more calcium than the surrounding soil. It's just this remarkable, it's a fertiliser machine, literally, that the earthworm is producing, as well as, so it's taking care of the minerals, and it's also breeding in its gut this unique range of organisms that you can't get elsewhere. Now, what's been found is that if you can harvest those organisms, and it's pretty expensive to do it with vermicast, but if you've got earthworms in your soil and you made the 25 earthworms per shovelful, earthworm castings are $1 a kilo, $1 a litre actually in Bunnings. You can buy them in bulk if you're doing really well in truckloads for $200 a tonne. But just do the sums, 300 times $200 a tonne, that's $60,000 worth of free fertiliser you got. You don't really need, you've hit pay dirt literally at that point. So getting earthworms back is massive, but probably the most important part of that equation is this whole challenge that we face with climate change, and the recognition that earthworms can decompose organic matter and turn it into humus, which is part of the equation of how we can avert a climate change disaster, is that the lion's share of what's up there in that blanket trapping the heat, changing the climate, the sun passes through it, moves up, some of it's trapped, it's the greenhouse blanket, and it's thicker than it's ever been from carbon, and twice that carbon from everything else. There's 250 gigatons that came from industry and coal-fired power stations and motor vehicles and so forth, but 476 was in the soils now up there. We've gone from 5% organic matter, which is the largest storehouse of carbon on the planet. We've gone from 5% down to 1.5%. So it's pretty important to bring back some organic matter. And when you do increase organic matter, you can't say, I made some new carbon, because you didn't. There's no such thing. Same carbon molecules that have cycled since the start of time. That's what dust to dust in the Bible. We've all been something else. That's why we're all intimately, inextricably interrelated, because we're all made of carbon, and that carbon goes elsewhere, and you don't make new stuff. You can't make new carbon. So when your soil test shows you've increased or doubled your organic matter because you did the right kind of things to do that, and earthworms is a big part of that, that's direct carbon sequestration. That's carbon as part of the carbon cycle that otherwise would have been up there, and now it's down in the soil because you grabbed it and stepped into that cycle and stored it. And earthworms are just mind-bogglingly important in that equation. And how many people have got good numbers of earthworms in their soil, just to get a feel? Wow, that's unusual, because obviously you're not large commercial growers, because a lot of the things that we do or that they do in commercial growing damages the earthworms. But to give you an idea of just how powerful the juice, as they call it, which is really just those microbes that are found in the castings that came from their gut, that they incubated these unique range of organisms. There's quite a famous broadacre grower, Di Hegarty and her husband, in West Australia, and they took 600 acres, they bought a 600 acre farm of probably the worst soil in Australia. It's the West Australian wheat belt is just beach sand. It literally looks like sand, and you're trying to grow food in that thing. And they grow wheat if they get rain, and they put on enough NPK fertiliser. So they built this, and they used this technology of creating vermicast extracts, and that's what I'm going to teach you how you can set up for yourself. And basically have been so successful, they just liquid inject, which you squirt it down as you put the seed down, this liquid that they extract from the vermicast. And sometimes they do a foliar spray of a couple of trace minerals that are lacking during the season, but it's a very low cost, low input that everyone says, oh come on, you've got to spend $300 a hectare on fertiliser. And they're now 12,000 hectares from 600 acres of just one of the biggest success stories in West Australia, and they've become internationally famous. And that's been based upon the potential really of liquid vermicast. So what people do if they've got their little worm farm, who's got a worm farm? So we've got a few, and so the normal deal is you've got your little bins, and you've got the leachade, it's called leachade, the liquid that comes from the bottom of them. Now, what's been recognised now, and a good example was Claudia. Claudia, my partner, she's a wonderfully passionate worm farmer, and she's got small bins and she's got big 1,000-litre bins, which are quite easy to construct for yourself on a large scale, and you isolate off the bottom component with the tap in it, and then you've got like 120 litres of worm juice, a leachade that comes through. So she's got this seething mass. The family's got a restaurant and all the food goes in there, and it's just, you wouldn't see more earthworms in that scenario, or more composting worms in that scenario. So there's a little meter I'll teach you to use a little later if we get a chance, that measures microbial biomass, and we thought, okay, let's test this, and you need to be above 30 to be any good. And we think, well, she's going to be 50 or 60, and we test the leachade. This is the liquid this leached through, and it's 18. It's a really real good wake-up call of why extracts are very different to leachades. And then we take some of the castings and we put them in a bucket and we stir it, violently, hose it, 2 or 3 minutes, let it settle, and then take that liquid, and it measures 118. So it was 18 first, and then it's 118, which is just really high, like it's off the charts of counts, which is what you'd imagine with your worm farms. And that's what, then you realise that leachade at the bottom, that's just a few unfortunate escapees. They didn't want to leave their home base where all the food was, they just happened to drip through. And they're really low numbers compared to taking that castings where everyone wants to be in their home base, the humus home base, and blasting them off there, which is what you're effectively doing with the leachade. And then you've got this liquid that's exactly how they do it in this very successful broadacre story. But there are farmers all over and gardeners all over who are discovering the potential. And that applies to a compost as much as it applies to vermicompost. They're taking a compost, in your case in a 20-litre bucket. I don't know how good the local one is that they produce down here at the council, but we can test and tell you. But putting it in there and blasting everything off it. I mean, the commercial growers have large tanks, and they have these huge air pumps that just swirl like a washing machine, and they leave it for half an hour, and they're found with the meter that measures it, that half an hour's double, quarter of an hour, and 35 minutes is the sweet spot. So they put a timer on it and they blast it all off, and they wait till it settles, and then they actually use this trash pump that can take solids, and it pumps it into a separator that takes off the solids and leaves the liquid. It's a vibrating screen that just does this. It's on a huge scale on broadacre farming, but they're into it on a really large scale now. But so we've done a 1,000-litre bin if you wanted to make that model of a larger worm farm, it's only $200 to set up, but you take, we call them shuttles. I don't know, what do you call them here?
Pods.
What are they?
Pods.
Pods, yeah. So you take a 1,000 litre pod, or a tote, some people call them, and basically you grab a grinder, and the top level, they've got the aluminium frame on the outside. You chop through that aluminium frame and the plastic on the inside with a grinder. So you've got a sleeve with the lid on the top that you've pulled out of it. You've taken the top frame off, and now you've got the sleeve of plastic with the lid on the top. And you drop that on the ground, and you grab a 1.5 mil cordless drill, and you go bzz, 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 all over it like a sieve. And you create a sieve on the top, and then you grab that and drop it into the tank. So the lid's on the top still, and you think, how's that fitting? Because it's a flexible plastic thing and it actually fits. Sometimes you can put a couple of bricks to keep, because it's going to carry the weight of everything above it. And then you've got an open top still, and you take a 2x2 frame and you bolt that to the metal frame, the square piece of the metal frame that's now, where you've chopped through. And you bolt that on, then you take another 2x2 frame and you screw it together, so you've got this frame that you've screwed together like a picture frame, and then you hinge it to the first frame and put a bit of iron on top. So even though it sounds like, that sounds like a big job, it's not. And now you've got your worm bin, you put a handle on top of that and you can lift that up. You set it up on concrete blocks so that you can get a 20 litre bucket underneath that tap, and that little reservoir that you've created with the sleeve that you've dropped in there holds 120 litres of that leachate. But that's leachate, still okay, but nowhere as good as the vermicast that was created within there. But you've got this whole 1,000 litres, so then you've got your bin ready once you've got your lid on the top and your base set up, and set it up on the concrete block so you can get the bucket under there easily, because you can't move it once it's filled with stuff. Then you get a bale, just a square bale of cocoa peat. It's the cheapest way to do it. You put it in a wheelbarrow and you fill the wheelbarrow, and you think, that's going to be too much water, but it's not. The whole thing dissolves and it's a wheelbarrow full of nice moist mulch, and you put that on the bottom of your new worm farm, and you buy your first 1 kilo, costs $100 from Bunnings, of worms, or you haven't got Bunnings, but wherever you can get worms from. And they then go to work, and every 6 weeks they subdivide, and you feed them lawn clippings and manure and food scraps. They don't like onions, but there's most things you can feed them. They don't like citrus peel, but everything else they seem to like. They love pawpaws, for example. And they just keep on breeding. And unlike human beings, when they get to the saturation point, when they say, yep, we've got a cubic metre here, we've got however many million worms, that's enough. And they stop subdividing, they stop breeding. Unlike humans who just keep on going. But so that's the point when you start selling your worms, and people can make really good money from them. They can. I've got some farmers, and this guy and his wife decided she really liked doing this, and not only does she do, the worms for people to buy for worm farms and for farmers to use to set up their own worm operations, but she also discovered a little niche market for a specific worm that's a little larger, that's sold as bait worms, and she puts 10 of these into a little packet with a little bit of castings for $10, and she makes about $3,000 a week selling these worms. So it's actually probably better than what he's doing on the farm. So there's some commercial potential there for them, for sure.
Australia, or
That's in Australia, yeah.
but just internally, obviously.
Yeah. Yeah.
Grant, can I just ask another question?
Yeah.
I gave up on my beautiful worm farm because it turned into a cockroach farm as well.
Yeah.
So what do you do with that?
You can. It's a little bit involved, but there is actually an organism. We actually sell it, but there's an organism they're called entomopathogenic fungi, and they eat insects. They actually create a furry mould all over them and eat them, and they can kill cockroaches. In that case, you'd spray that inside there, and the cockroaches all get this disease. Well, it's called green muscatine disease. It's only insects that get it, and the cockroaches die. So that's one option. There's another option. There's a wonderful, if you can get it on the island at any point, it's just to make, you could actually make it, it's not that easy to make yourself, but who's heard of wood vinegar before?
Yes.
Some of you have heard of it. So we've been working for 2 years just looking at it, because there was all these reports coming in, and I thought, surely it can't be that, it's too good a story. So we've had my research team looking at it, and it is just absolutely remarkable. So what it is biochar. Who's heard of biochar before? So biochar comes from this finding in the in the Amazon of these amazing soils called terra preta soils. Most productive soils anyone's ever seen. You can dig down 2 metres and it's just crumbly black soil, and it's so productive it's insane. And they discovered that the villagers had this habit that they sort of often cooked like the Maoris with the hangi scenario, so it was sort of this what's called pyrolysis burning, where it's all trapped inside there, and the charcoal that you grow from that in the village was to take and plant outside the village. They just dig a hole and put it in there, and they discovered from that it triggered this mechanism of the soil, this black soil literally growing from the village edges, and there's never really been any soils that anyone's ever seen like it. So the world got really excited about the concept of biochar and whether we could commercialise that, and of course it also tends to fix carbon and speed the fixing of carbon, and so it's lots of potential to kind of planet saving potential. And I took a truckload that someone had given me on one of the research farms, and we tried it at all varying rates, and we really didn't see a great response for it. And so I reasoned that it was a bunch of organisms that partner with biochar, and that's the secret, and that's a unique group of organisms that they're probably not going to give us. And so I sort of gave up on it, but I've changed my heart, and I've apologised to the conferences where I said, that was the story, because there's a microbiologist I work with in South Africa, and I had breakfast with her, as I always do. Her and a partner, the gay woman, who are both microbiologists, have worked for 50 years on one species, which is mycorrhizal fungi. And the claim to fame of this little creature that burrows into the plant root and spreads out is that it spits out a substance called glomalin that builds humus more rapidly. In fact, 1/3 of all the humus comes from one organism that's not there anymore. And what we discovered when we looked hard is that biochar fires up mycorrhizal fungi, and that's so just back to the biochar story. So they found that when you burn and you capture the smoke, it's called a smoke condensate, all of the 200 plus compounds that were in the wood, and it varies between different types of wood, but they've all got good stuff in them, that ends up in this condensate. The smell's incredibly like smoke. You put a little bit on your hand for 2 days, people say, oh, you've been burning off, have you? And you can't get the smell off there. And that smell has been identified as, it's actually the Aboriginal word for smoke, which is carrick. And now they've found this whole group of biochemicals called carrikins that, the Aboriginals knew they burnt off, and that some seeds only germinated in the presence of that smoke. And now they find that substance called carrikin stimulates every known plant, including germination and plant growth. But not just that, insects hate it. Whether it's they're conditioned not to like smoke, or whether there's some other biochemical compound in there, but it works amazingly as an insecticide and a fungicide and a plant growth stimulant. So it's just like this it will be one of the biggest inputs in regenerative agriculture in the quite near future. People are discovering it all over.
Did you say any wood, or did you say certain types?
No, you can use any wood, but some vary in terms of their biochemical compound.
Do it in a hollow, and you've got to cool it fast, don't you?
Yeah, so the biochar thing, but the biochar's easy.
Yeah.
You just basically can take a 200 litre drum and slice an oval out the top of it. Yeah. And if you go online, there's a technique on how you construct your fire so that it takes the oxygen from the lower half, so you've got a low oxygen environment to create the char. And once you've done that for 2 or 3 hours and got your char there, you pour water on it. You have a bung in the bottom of the drum that opens. You drench it completely, and then you can recharge it with, we'll teach you later on this afternoon how to brew some of these wonderful organisms, and you charge the biochar, which is it just explodes open when you put that water on it, and you've just got all these pores that'll hold anything. And then you can put microbes in, then you've got this wonderful thing you put in the soil that's got already charged up with the microbes. You can even put nutrients in there if you want to, and they'll all hold in there. Yeah, but the making of the wood vinegar is a bit different because you've got to have a special thing that will capture that condensation, and that's pretty hard to do at home.
Yeah.
But the biochar itself.
I was in New Guinea last year. There's a lot of wood vinegar in New Guinea.
Okay.
They give it away for free there.
Really? Wow. Yeah, the Thai government's got right in behind it. They've got a lot of research and all sorts of wonderful findings with it. It's just this remarkable thing.
So the mycorrhizals come out of that biochar, they're already in.
No. So the mycorrhizal fungi you've got to introduce. Yeah, you can get mycorrhizal spores, and you just introduce them to the biochar, and that then gives you this wonderful kind of response. The mycorrhizal fungi, unlike most microbes that you can use on the farm, both fungi and bacteria can actually be brewed, which makes it really cost effective. We'll teach you later how you can brew a wonderful thing called a lactobacillus brew and how simple it is. It really is easy. We'll teach it in the second half this afternoon. But most organisms can, but mycorrhizal can't. They only live on a living plant. You can't just put them in a compost and they grow. They live on a living plant. You've got to harvest them from a living plant. But if you can take seedlings, as I mentioned at Matt's place, and get some of the powder and dilute it into water and dip the seedlings in there. Now you've got mycorrhizal for the whole life, unless you kill it off with some kind of chemical. You've got mycorrhizal fungi for the whole rest of your life, sort of thing. If you were, say, going to put some clover seed out here, the secret bit would be to douse the clover seed or dampen the clover seed with some of this diluted mycorrhizal fungi spores. Then they go in there, and then they'll jump from that to the kikuyu and to the other plants, and you'll have this tenfold increase in root area of these wonderful creatures that go out and mine water and mine minerals and so forth. And most importantly is the finding that mycorrhizal fungi spit out this substance called glomalin that we now know is the most important triggering mechanism for building humus and sequestering carbon. So one creature that's not there anymore is responsible for 30% of all soil carbon, which is about what we need to pull out of the atmosphere. So the obvious thing is to put them back, and everyone to put them back where they can, and to then not kill them off like we did with fungicides and nematicides and things, and herbicides, all of which kill mycorrhizal fungi. They're quite sensitive. And there'll be legislation that you won't be able to use things like nematicides, because nematicides that kill root knot nematodes, they kill every known form of mycorrhizal fungi and a lot of other things. And at some point they'll be illegal. You simply won't be able to use them. See, the two things that we weren't told about, the current sort of chemical experiment, I call it, which is 10 years of producing food using rescue chemicals that science has created to solve the problems. The two things we weren't told about that issue yet, we tested them and we showed that a guinea pig can live with 5 parts per million of diethane or 3 parts per million of glyphosate in that 3-month trial. And we said, yeah, okay, so there's minimum residue levels, we don't want more than that. But there's two things we weren't told, and one of the most important ones is actually called the cocktail effect. And if you understand anything about chemistry, if you put 3 chemicals together, almost always a fourth one's formed. Well, no one's ever done any research into those fourth chemicals. You eat a snow pea with 11 residues on average on it, even though they're tiny amounts, hopefully. What about the combinations then? How many other new things are in there? No one's ever looked. So I was in the US training the Dole Corporation, it's a very large corporation, and the Murdoch, it's not Rupert, but it's another bloke who owns Dole. They're 6.5 billion, they're a huge company. One of his mates was there. He's a billionaire who's lost 3 wives to cancer, and so he decided to fund some research into 10 commonly used farm chemicals and their combinations and what combinations there were. And so they did this 2-year study looking at 100 combinations, and I mean there were thousands of combinations of 10 things from 1 to 100%, and they found 3 new class 3 carcinogens, which means in that time they proved that combination gave cancer to animals. It's a little less ethical in 3 years to show that it does for humans, but we can assume there's an issue. And that we weren't told that. We weren't told we're eating a whole bunch of stuff no one's ever researched. And that's why if we can get away from the chemicals, it's a huge story. Yeah.
If you finish that, I just want to go back to biochar.
Yeah, I'll just finish one last next thing, and then we'll go back to biochar. So that's number one. That's called the cocktail effect. The second thing is called bioaccumulation. How does your body manage all those little tiny residues? Well, your liver is the most important organ, more important than your heart. It's got a detoxification system, and if the chemicals are copied off nature, which half of them are, the liver's got a system to help detoxify and minimise that little bit of toxic influence. But half of the chemicals we created, and the liver says, what the bloody hell is this thing? Because it knows the structure is not right, and so it pumps it off and it stores it in our fat cells. And that's called bioaccumulation. That's why you don't want to lose weight fast if you're overweight, because that gets released and you get very sick. So then they test 1,400 school children, 700 from towns, 700 from rural areas, for the 13 most commonly used chemicals that everyone uses on farms. So fungicides, pesticides, herbicides, nematicides, a wormicide that every cattle farmer here will be using. And they checked those, and they checked tissue, which is not very pleasant, but they did hair, saliva, urine and tissue on these kids, and they couldn't find one child of 1,400 kids who didn't have unacceptable levels according to FDA standards of all 13 farm chemicals. That's called bioaccumulation. It's just building up there in the tissues. And it's a time bomb, and there's no debates, there's no dispute, there's no argument about the cause of the largest killer of our kids, which is childhood leukemia. It's environmental chemicals. You can't argue it, it's what it is. And the ludicrous part about that scenario is that whether you're farming or growing or doing anything or even eating food, all you've got to do is look at the active ingredient. Anyone can do it. So, okay, let's look at paraquat and cancer, paraquat and neurological disorders, and you'll see all the research. And every chemical's got the research, and we're all just eating it. And you just shake your head in disbelief. and you wonder why we've got so much Parkinson's, Alzheimer's
Just on the liver
and
thing-
cancer.
On the liver thing, if anyone wants to do liver cleanses, I'm very good at helping people do them.
Yeah, which is not a bad
24-hour
concept.
liver cleanses. It's
Okay.
really worth it.
Good.
Thank
Yeah,
you.
so-
Right, well, we
Biochar. The council are planning to process or to produce biochar, so I'm going to
Good.
drop Tara in it
Oh,
to explain how much we're going to produce and what from.
yeah, I'm probably not the person to actually.
She's a bus driver today.
And I actually don't
Not
work.
here, the big
I actually
ones,
don't
so-
work in the waste section, so I don't know if Jodie knows anymore. I'll put Jodie into it.
No, I don't know either, sorry.
Yeah, and it's possibly going to be used into another product, wasn't it, Jodie? Is that the last thing we heard?
Where's Phil?
Phil is hoping to come back, so we can ask him.
Maybe this afternoon.
And it would really be worth looking at whether you can make wood vinegar as a byproduct as
we
well.
should move on while there's no rain.
Yeah.
If, I don't know,
I'll quickly explain how this vermicast thing works. I'll just demonstrate that. So we'd use our bottom level. It's as simple as this. About this thickness for the first layer. And we'll only do it on that size just to give you an idea. That's your starting point. And then you're going to moisten that down. At the moment it's quite wet anyway, but you're going to water that down. Now that would be the grassy layer, and then you might put the loose in, but if we've only got two it still works. Then you put the manure on top of that, water that down, then another layer of this, another layer of manure. You build it to about this height and about a metre wide, a bit wider than that. And then it will start cooking and it will get quite hot. So you can't put earthworms in there or the composting worms in there until basically it's cooled down again. And that might take about 2.5 weeks until you put your hand in there quite safely, and it might be mildly warm, but that's the time you bring your worms in. And you put your worms in one end and they then work their way through, and they do it quite neatly. I mean, they do all of it and they gradually work their way through to the end. And like if you started off with say 5 metres, when you get to the end you just add to it and they just follow it and you harvest behind them basically. So you've got this lovely castings, and you can when you've got your pile this big, you could walk into his piles and put your hand in and just solid worms, just a handful of worms in there. And what he would then do is take a couple of buckets. I mean, we're talking larger scale, but a couple of 20-litre buckets full of the castings from one end. You know, the worms are up here somewhere, and then he'd put them in this big tea bag. It's a sort of a mesh bag that's very, very fine because you don't want to clog up your filters when you're spraying things out through the centre pivots. And then he put a high pressure hose in there. So it's like you made a tea bag. You have a little metal rod that sort of clicks onto, because it's quite heavy to hold it once it's filled with wet castings. And then you just blast it. And he blasts it all into a 200-litre drum. And he does the 2 buckets into the 200-litre drum. Then he puts the 200-litre drum, tips it into a 1,000-litre container, fills it up with water, and then he just feeds that through a centre pivot. But that's all he was doing with these wonderfully healthy crops. And I realised, my God, this is so easy. We went straight home and did it. You know, it's the simplest thing in the world. Anyone can do it. And then you just follow it along and you just harvest behind it. And you do that extract. So if you understand the extract model, you basically, unlike the leachade, you're taking, and he just takes the spent stuff and just chucks it back into the pile again. So it kind of recharges. But basically you're taking that humus with all of those unique organisms, and lots of them in huge diversity, and you're kind of blasting them off their home base. So it's really quite high pressure that you're stirring it around and just blasting them off. Now the bigger guys, as I said, have got big swirling washing machine type tanks, but in your case you can do it with a stick and a bucket. And you just stir and stir and stir as fast as you can, and then let it settle out. Now you've made an extract, and that's the best way, because that's everything. So the other concept is things like compost teas, where you could take some of that, and with a bubbler, as I mentioned, and some food source, you can brew them up 24 hours and you've multiplied many times what you started with. But the only downside, there's nothing wrong with it, but the only downside to that is that you select for, out of maybe 30,000 organisms that are present there, you selected for 20 of them that love oxygen. And they take over. If you give them the right conditions, they just take over, and the tank's full of oxygen lovers. But if you've got a soil that doesn't breathe well, it's a tight soil, it's got whatever conditions in it that you can't really push your shovel too deep into or whatever, and you put those organisms out there, they're saying, well, we can't breathe, they've got the specialists for high oxygen. So while it can be really beneficial, and there are a couple of organisms in there that can be, with compost teas, that can be beneficial, this extract idea, whether it's vermicast or compost, blasting them off there and getting the full diversity, that's what nature wants. That's the central rule of nature, is biodiversity. The more the merrier is how it grows. So, I've got a guy, one of the huge things that has happened in agriculture is this concept of cocktail cover crops, and I'm sort of surprised to see no one doing it on the island. I mean, farmers are keener on their cover crops now than they are on their main crops. They keep on sending me photos of their what are called cocktail cover crops. And so, again, it's about diversity. Every plant feeds something different, and we put monoculture in, it feeds one group of organisms, attracts one group of pests, and it's like anti-science because nature wants biodiversity. So bringing in these multi-species cover crops, even in an orchard scenario, and putting them under it is bringing back that biodiversity that you're seeking. And so the finding from this guy who they're talking about giving a Nobel Prize is that if you can get 5 families of plants into one of these species, and more than one of each, then there's this miraculous kind of thing that's been discovered happens. So the 5 families, just so you know: cereals, grasses, brassicas, legumes, and the missing link, and it's only a tiny percentage of it, 1%, is called chenopods. Looks like it's spelt chenopods, C-H-E-N-O pods, but it's actually spelt chenopods. And that's everything in the beet family, amaranth, quinoa, and spinach. It's a real small group, but you've got to have that 1%, because what they've discovered is that you get this huge change in soil structure when you put them together that you've never seen before, anything like it. People say, I can't believe this. It's like I put 4 cover crops in and I saw that change in one season. So some scientists went out there to see what was happening, and they found only when 4 doesn't work, when the 5 species are present, the plant roots all start messaging each other, and they start pouring really substantial, measurable amounts of substances called phenolic compounds into the soil. Now, that's why we eat dark chocolate or chew on blueberries or drink green tea, because they're the most powerful of all the natural antioxidants. So just like our cells, our 10 trillion cells rejoice in the presence of an input of those antioxidants, the soil life says, you beauty, and they basically go into hyperdrive when all this stuff pours into the soil, is what the finding is. So it's a hell of a thing.
Graham, really quick question.
Yeah.
A bit of a dumb question. But for
No
many
such thing.
years I've been throwing my tea bags into my garden.
Yeah.
What's the exact benefit of that?
Well, it's just organic matter that can help. I mean, a better benefit is the coffee grinds, because the coffee grinds are really rich in potassium and they can really serve a good role. And the ash from your fire, if you've got one, you never waste that. That's 18% potassium. It's not called potash by accident.
Yep.
And it's very unstable. So if you can get it into a compost and then that stabilises the potassium, ash and compost is the best thing. The fire ash in your compost is just a wonderful thing to
Thank you,
include.
Graham.
Okay, yeah.
Could you just repeat the 5?
Okay, so grasses. So you might use something like ryegrass or what's Sudan grass. They're 2 very common ones on the mainland. Grasses, cereals, so you might have millet or whatever. Legumes, so it might be clovers or peas or beans or whatever. Brassicas, and the very common and very popular brassica, it's really interesting. This guy just came up. It's called a daikon radish, so it's a long thin radish. Yeah, and so this guy has named it a tillage radish. It's just the same thing. It's not a new hybrid. He patented, it cost him 40 grand, he patented the name tillage radish. So every shop you go into, they've got daikon and tillage, and they're the same. And the tillage is 25% more, and that goes into his pocket. He's actually made $42 million, I heard last, from naming something. Because everyone wants tillage radish, because it breaks through hard pans like a tillage. It's wonderful stuff, and that becomes your brassica component. But I had a patch on one of my farms. So I go ginger, which is the ultimate cash crop other than marijuana, $25 a kilo, 40 tonnes a hectare. Do the sums, $1 million a hectare. There's no other crop that can do that. And I wanted to put this paddock in ginger, and the cattle have been on it, and you could take a penetrometer steel rod with a meter on the top that you can push down to see what your soil structure's like, and clonk, there's a hard pan here from the compaction of years of cattle on the paddock. So I looked everywhere to find these 5 species, but you didn't do it with more the merrier. I did 22, so I had 4 of this and 6 of this and 5 of this, but I managed to get them with just one chenopod, because it's only 1%, it just has to be there. But I had tillage radish, I had forage, kale, I had a few other brassicas, canola in there. and planted it. And you've got to see it to believe it. You get passionate when you see it. So I did this 4.5 month crop cycle with the cover crop, and then you walk in there and it's just whoosh to the bottom of the penetrometer everywhere. Step outside, clonk. Step inside, whoosh. And then you're sold. Oh my God, it's the best thing I've ever seen. So cover crops just become such a big thing. Everyone's doing it. Home gardeners are doing it, and no one's doing it here. You need to look at it.
There's a weed here called Chenopodium,
Yeah.
which is obviously
Yes.
in that family.
Oh, really? So yeah, if you've got a weed in the story, even fat hen is a chenopod.
That's it.
Oh, that's it.
And make sure it goes to seed.
Yeah, so a little bit of that. You only want 1%. You don't want a heap of fat hen, but a little tiny bit in there is all that's required to make sure you've got that component.
I don't think so.
Keep an eye on the time,
Okay.
because you're having another session.
So, yeah. So what time is it now?
It's after.
Almost 11:30.
Oh, so do we want to go down the bottom and have a look?
When you finish.
Well, basically that's the model. I mean, you've got the model. You do it. All composting is layer caking. You're making a layer cake. Whatever is a big circle, however you do it, and you alternate between a carbon layer and a nitrogen layer. So the carbon layer is, well, if this was browner, the green stuff's actually nitrogen, but if it was had been left longer to be browner, that's carbon, or it could be wood chip, it could be anything that's brown, is the carbon component. And so you'll set your little layer up, a big circle, small circle, whatever pile you want, and then normally you sprinkle some lime. Every commercial composting everywhere puts a little bit of lime on each layer. I'm not quite sure of what the purpose. It does change pH a little, but, and it's an important nutrient, of course. What's that, sorry? No, that's different because that's going to be back to the nitrogen component. So, but any other kind of any calcium you can get on there, and then they'll use a bit of former compost. So that's your inoculum, and you'll sprinkle that on that layer. Sometimes, if you've got trace minerals missing, you might put a little bit of a mineral fertilizer on there. You can use crusher dust. I'll talk at the other farm of what crusher dust is about and why it works, and we'll show you this thing called a broadcasting tower. Quite an unusual idea, but we'll show it at Phil's farm. But that's your first layer, and you wet it down. The layer cake is thing that you want even moisture throughout. So it's not just it's done. You've got to actually have it totally nicely moist throughout, because any patch that's not moist is not going to cook, and you're going to have an uneven compost. So the layer cake allows you to get that whole thing. Now you put your carbon. You've got your carbon. Now you're going to put your nitrogen layer. Now that can either be pure green stuff or cow manure, which is full of nitrogen. So that then you have your little layer of cow manure on there, you sprinkle the lime, the former compost, you wet it down, the crusher dust if you want. You wet that down, then you do your next layer and you just build up your layer cake. And then it starts cooking, and you've got with the conventional compost, and you start turning it. But there's also a way of composting that's become my favourite, which involves anaerobic composting. And the anaerobic composting, you can mix it together once, and that's it. You cover it over with a cover, you put some tyres or concrete blocks or logs on it, completely anaerobic. 2 months later you come back and there's this beautiful black compost there. And I'll teach you how you make the lactobacillus brew at the other farm that allows you to do that. It's called anaerobic composting.
Just bring out that rubbish bin. That's got stuff from the council dump.
The rubbish bin.
That's got stuff from the council dump that's just shredded palm and.
Yeah, so that's the kind of carbon layer that you would classically use. This is more almost a nitrogen layer because it's still green.
It's not been through the hot rod composter. That's just the raw material.
So you can see here, what's really good is to try and get a soil that will have some kind of fungal presence in there, because they're lacking in most soils we look at. And these kind of composts, you can see this is called saprophytic fungi, this white stuff that you can see here. That's what every soil needs. It's really, really important. There's a ratio called the fungi to bacteria ratio that's actually the most important ratio in growing food. And it's the most important ratio in saving the day as well, for a whole variety of reasons. So when we talk about carbon, you can mow your lawn clip. You could take this and pile it in the corner. In fact, it probably already has started warming. Well, it hasn't, but usually they would by now. And it'll warm up quite quickly. And that's bacteria. Bacteria, every creature has what's called a carbon to nitrogen ratio. And bacteria got more nitrogen in their body. We're 30 to 1, trees are 500 to 1, bacteria 5 to 1 carbon to nitrogen, which means 17% of their body's nitrogen, and they love nitrogen. So they come woofing into that green colour, which is nitrogen. Chlorophyll is predominantly nitrogen. And they come woofing in, and it heats up, and you've got your compost 3 or 4 months later, your lawn clipping compost. You pile it on your garden, it turns several shades darker because you can put on huge amounts. you get a nice response with your tomatoes or whatever, and you come back and it's gone back to the same colour. That's called active humus made by bacteria, and that oxidises and goes back up into the atmosphere. So that's not what we need to save the planet, and that's where fungi are so important, because fungi, those little hyphae that you can see growing all over that, they will take the compost that the bacteria's made and the humus and they'll make some themselves, usually with more fibrous things than this kind of stuff. That's why they're there, because that's what they love. And they'll bond together, clay and humus, and the humus that they create, the organic matter they create, will be here after you've gone. It lasts for 35 years minimum.
That rubbish bin's got the raw material from the chipper, but over here these plastic bags have got the stuff that's been through the hot rod compost.
So there's actually a composting machine there now, is there?
Yeah.
Oh, good.
To have a rest and something, because you've got a 1 o'clock or something.
Okay, that's that.
So, do you mind if I just move us on?
No problems.
Please. These were planted in February 2020, so these are the longest serving ones, and they were so yellow for a while that I thought they must be short of nitrogen, and so I actually put some urea on, and I know that's a no-no, but I thought these plants are going to die if I don't do something.
Yeah.
And then they picked up sort of, and then all of a sudden last year they went whoosh like that, and they're green as grass. So they've either hit the dead chooks underneath, or they've hit good soil, or they've got the better moisture.
Yeah, you've had all that rain.
Even before the rain, they went green.
Oh, they went green.
They went
okay.
very green.
Good.
And we've had some excellent fruit off them. They're now in their second bearing. Some of these trees have got 2 bunches on them.
The rats eat the bananas?
The rats are terrible, absolutely terrible. These ones here are different species. There's lady's fingers and there's a couple of other varieties. Where's Derek?
Yeah.
The CSIRO people were thinking of damming the creek over there, and I think it's a plausible thing, but
You destroy the potential for growing through here.
You lose the use of here, because if you had anything growing and it flooded and stayed there for a while, it'd all drown.
well, that's what happened to some of those things at the up in that other gully. That water backed up and it backed up here too. Water drowned the pawpaws and that I had.
But the silver lining would be that you'd be a waterfront property.
Yeah. And you could sell your water.
Yeah.
I mean, this paddock has they've got the most productive potential on the place.
So, did you hear that, Graham?
Yeah, so the paddock down here with all of the wash off and all of the accumulation is the most fertile in the whole place, and it showed that on the soil test as well. And as I said, historically they've grown potatoes and beans and grown really good bean crops and things there.
Right.
So yeah, I mean it's the kind of prime. It's flat. It's got all the sun. That's the perfect area. You just work that up and plant it. You could grow tomatoes. You could grow anything in there.
Well, share farming with some young person who wanted to work it is a possibility.
Yeah, well that's not a bad concept.
And the Food and Farming Alliance is set up to try and put people in touch with each other like that. That's a possibility.
It's just whether you'd have enough water to, once you get into sort of more intensive stuff, you need quite a bit of water.
Yes,
Yeah.
well that would be a problem.
Yeah.
If you had it as a dam, you could have a water ski resort here with condominiums.
We planted potatoes in this very nice patch of soil here, and they completely failed, but I think potatoes all over the island failed, so I'm not too much on my conscience. The other mistake I made was to plant the passion fruits before building the trellises. So half the passion fruits are lying on the ground now. But we're getting a bit short of time, but if you'd like to walk up the hill slowly through the vegetable garden, the track should be stable.
Which is up the
hill.
Up your
if
stairs.
you don't want to face the stairs, then you can go back the way we came, which is a bit more gentle. But there's a lot of lessons in the vegetable garden.
Okay.
And there's one Hawaiian passion fruit that's ripe. So if Snowy's got a knife, he could cut it open. And those who haven't had a Hawaiian passion fruit can have half a passion fruit.
Well, if he's got the knife, good luck getting that off him.
Any questions?
And if anyone does need to get back into town by 12, Phil's up the top and he's happy to take anyone back if they do.
Yeah, there's chocos on the high side of this one. There's actually one there that you can harvest. Just go around the other side, Derek, and
Okay.
you'll see it. It's on this corner.
Right.
There's also a granadilla that's re-sprouted this year after the cold.
Have you had fruit off the
Yes,
granadilla? Have you ever had fruit from your granadilla?
we had one good fruit, one good
Yeah.
sized fruit, which I've got the seed from and growing the seed.
Oh, good.
So I'm going
They're
to plant a row of
superb
them right
fruit.
here.
They're superb fruit, the
They're
granadillas.
lovely, yeah.
Delicious.
Oh, summary words or?
Well, the short summary is that most of the examples we've seen of plants not doing too well are because you've been playing with nothing, you know, and you can't, when you've got a soil that's deficient in 5 things, one of them being nitrogen, one of them being potassium, you can't really get vibrant growth without those things. So while it's kind of idealistic and it's classic with people growing organically to say, well, I did nothing and let nature take care of it, well, unless if you haven't got it, you haven't got it. And nitrogen is most abundant, potassium second most abundant. If they're not in the soil, they're not going to be in the plant. So even putting some chicken manure underneath the plants to get them kick-started and a handful of lime would make a huge difference to the vitality and the growth of them.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Can I thank Graham very much, and Claudia, who's gone to fix the car, I think, very much for.
Thank you.
Thank Phil and Tara and for organising this, and especially thank you all for booking in and for lasting the distance and coping with the hills and doing us the honour of coming along to have a look at our place.
Thank you for sharing.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much. Much appreciated.